Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive deep into a period of history that's as fascinating as it is downright absurd. Picture this. People in medieval times loved their wine. But what if I told you that many of them didn't just enjoy it for its taste, but because they thought it was their health? That's right. Back in the day, people were convinced that wine was the key to everything, from curing ailments to protecting against evil spirits. But there was a dark twist. Some wines came with a deadly dose of poison. Now, you're probably thinking, poisoned wine? How in the world did that happen? Well, medieval trends were often influenced by some bizarre medical practices. Scholars still argue whether the wine itself was tainted by unregulated brewing methods or if poisons were intentionally added to make it healthier, or at least to preserve it for longer. People would drink wines mixed with lead, mercury, and other substances they believed would balance the humors in their bodies. Yeah, it sounds insane now, but at the time, it was considered cutting-edge health advice. But guess what? The poison did more harm than good, and plenty of medieval drinkers ended up dead or seriously ill. You can almost imagine the scene. People gathering in lavish banquets, clinking their goblets, unknowingly sipping on death. And while the poisons were often subtle, over time, they would lead to organ failure, chronic illness, and, of course, death. It wasn't uncommon for people to end up dead in their prime due to these supposedly healing wines. The unfortunate truth is that this trend continued for centuries before anyone realized the damage it was causing. Wine, something that's celebrated today for its cultural significance and enjoyment, was once a potential death sentence, all because of misguided beliefs. So, next time you enjoy a glass of wine, take a moment to think about the poor souls who were unlucky enough to drink the medieval version. Cheers to not being poisoned. Tonight's journey takes us to the tightly laced world of medieval fashion. Imagine yourself walking into a grand ballroom, your dress or tunic perfectly fitted with an impossibly tiny waistline thanks to the corset, a trend that ruled the fashion scene for centuries. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just the elite trying to look elegant. Corsets became so extreme that they literally squeezed the life out of people. And this obsession with tiny waists was more dangerous than you'd think. You wander through the streets, feeling the pressure of the corset pulling at your ribs. Tight lacing was a common practice to achieve the ideal silhouette, one that was small, delicate, and of course, deadly. Scholars still argue whether the corset was primarily a tool for beauty or whether it was also used for a sense of power and control, but one thing's for sure. It did not end well for many. The laces pulled so tightly that the wearer's internal organs were pushed out of place, leading to a variety of health issues, including fainting, difficulty breathing, and even rib fractures. Women, in particular, suffered from compressed lungs, weakened hearts, and digestive issues. And let's not forget about the broken ribs from the constant pressure. Over time, the corset became more and more restrictive, with some women trying to lace themselves to such extremes that they'd end up fainting from lack of oxygen. As ridiculous as it sounds today, many people in the medieval and Renaissance periods saw this as the height of fashion and would willingly risk their lives for it. And this wasn't just a trend for the wealthy. It trickled down to all classes, making it a universal, deadly obsession. Now, imagine trying to walk through life, constantly under pressure, not just from society's demands, but from the literal tightness of your clothing. The pursuit of beauty was no longer just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. So next time you see a historical painting with a perfectly laced waist, remember, it wasn't all elegance and grace. Sometimes it was a painful, breathless struggle for survival. We're venturing into the wild and sometimes deadly world of medieval cuisine. Picture yourself sitting at a grand feast, surrounded by towering platters of exotic foods, things you've never seen before. Sure, they look fascinating, but the truth is, many of these foods were not only strange, but also deadly. You may have heard of some odd medieval food trends, but did you know that eating exotic foods was a surefire way to meet an untimely end in the medieval world? You wander into a royal banquet hall where delicacies from far-off lands are laid before you. The tables are laden with peacock, flamingo, and even exotic birds like swans. But don't get too excited. Many of these rare dishes were also dangerous, sometimes prepared with little regard for hygiene or safety. Scholars still argue whether these foods were consumed to show off wealth or if they were believed to have special properties, but one thing's for sure. Eating these foods could sometimes lead to a quick and painful death. One of the most infamous examples of dangerous medieval food was the consumption of mercury-laden fish, which was thought to cure ailments, but instead caused poisoning. The medieval elite often sought the exotic flavors of the East, including foods seasoned with spices that could be harmful. Yet, the true dangers were often in the way food was prepared. It wasn't uncommon for feasts to feature undercooked meats, fermented fish, and foods seasoned with lead or other toxic substances. And then there were the hallucinogenic mushrooms, often mistaken for edible ones, leading to fatal poisoning. Imagine biting into what seems like a simple mushroom, only to be paralyzed, delusional, or even dead hours later. The medieval world was filled with culinary experimentation, but many didn't realize the deadly consequences of indulging in these strange foods. These deadly foods weren't reserved for the poor either. Even the royalty indulged in dangerous feasts, eager to impress their guests with rarities from foreign lands. But in the end, it wasn't all about the display of wealth. It was a gamble with life itself. So, next time you think about trying something truly exotic, remember that these medieval delicacies could end up being a lethal meal. Fellow time traveler, now let's take a detour into one of the more bizarre trends of the medieval era: body modifications. You might think of tattoos and piercings as a modern thing, but medieval people took these practices to a whole new level. In fact, body modifications were seen as a symbol of status, beauty, and sometimes even religion. But here's where things get dark. Some of these modifications were not just painful, but also deadly. Imagine yourself in a bustling medieval marketplace where you spot a group of travelers with their faces and bodies covered in tattoos. But this wasn't your typical artwork. Medieval tattoos were often not just for decoration, but believed to have spiritual or protective purposes. However, the materials used for these tattoos were far from hygienic. Artists often used sharp, unsterilized needles and ink that was sometimes made from poisonous substances. Scholars still argue whether these tattoos were meant for beauty or were rooted in religious or protective beliefs, but what they all agree on is the serious health risks they posed. Infections were rampant, and many people died from sepsis after receiving their body modifications. Piercings, especially in the medieval upper class, were also a dangerous trend. Think of it. Piercing with crude metal needles, using unclean tools, and inserting jewelry made from materials that often didn't age well, like lead or low-quality silver. It's no surprise that these modifications often led to terrible infections. In some cases, the piercing was not just for aesthetic purposes, but was also believed to symbolize power, divine favor, or even the connection to a particular deity. While they were meant to elevate a person's status, these modifications, unfortunately, were also a one-way ticket to a grave. Then there were the extreme practices that really pushed the envelope. Some medieval people, in their quest for spiritual or bodily transformation, even attempted things like scalpels used to remove tattoos, which could go horribly wrong if not properly treated. And let's not forget about the medieval practice of cauterization, where wounds were sealed with hot irons. While intended to stop infections, it often led to further complications, blood poisoning, and death. A simple decorative decision to enhance one's beauty or spirituality often led to horrific consequences. This dark side of body modification was both a status symbol and a deadly gamble. So, the next time you think about getting a tattoo or piercing, take a moment to appreciate the sterilized equipment and modern knowledge that keeps us safe from the deadly consequences medieval people faced. Now, let's turn our attention to a major aspect of medieval life that, while well-meaning, often caused more harm than good: medicinal practices. Picture yourself walking into a medieval apothecary, surrounded by strange concoctions, jars of bizarre herbs, and dusty books filled with cures for everything from the common cold to severe illnesses. These remedies, however, were often as deadly as the diseases they were meant to cure. You might have heard of bloodletting, a practice that many medieval doctors swore by. They believed that illness was caused by an imbalance in the body's humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And the best way to restore balance was to literally let blood. Whether it was a leech treatment or a more direct method with a blade, this practice was so widespread that even kings and queens were subjected to it. But instead of curing anything, it often made patients weaker, sicker, and sometimes sent them to an early grave. Scholars still argue whether bloodletting was ever truly effective, with some pointing out that it may have worked in very specific cases. But for the most part, it was a medical disaster. Then there was the ever-popular miracle cure, which promised to heal anything from broken bones to incurable diseases. Apothecaries and herbalists often relied on things like mercury and arsenic, substances that are toxic to humans. One such cure was elixir of life, which supposedly promised immortality, but the ingredients? You guessed it, mercury and other heavy metals, leading to symptoms of poisoning, including tremors, kidney damage, and death. In addition to poisons, another beloved medieval treatment was treating ailments with animal parts. For example, people thought that grinding up the bones of a lion and consuming them would cure diseases like arthritis. Or they'd use crushed mummy powder, yes, powdered human mummies as a medicine. Not only was this practice disturbing, but it also caused a number of health issues, including poisoning and infections. And while it may sound like something out of a bad movie, this trend continued for centuries. Perhaps the most infamous medieval cure was the use of urine therapy. Yes, some believed that urine could cure wounds, relieve headaches, or treat infections. It wasn't just drinking it. Some people applied it to their skin or used it as a base for other concoctions. While urine itself isn't inherently dangerous, this practice could lead to severe infections, especially if the urine wasn't properly handled. In the end, these treatments weren't just ineffective, they were sometimes lethal. The eagerness to cure and fix every ailment, combined with an incomplete understanding of medicine, led to practices that were as harmful as they were popular. So, the next time you're feeling under the weather, take comfort in knowing we've come a long way from the medicinal practices that ruled the medieval world. We enter into the world of medieval medicine, where things took a truly revolting turn. Imagine yourself walking through a medieval village, hearing whispers about the latest healing remedies, and learning that the miracle cure for various ailments might just involve animal dung. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval folk were absolutely convinced that animal excrement had magical healing properties. But while it might sound like the plot of a bad comedy for many during that time, this disgusting practice was a matter of life or death. You wander through the local market and see people selling dung from various animals: cow, horse, chicken, and even pigeons, all packaged and promoted as cures for everything from headaches to infections. Scholars still argue about the origins of this strange belief, but it seems that many people in the medieval world were influenced by the ancient idea of sympathetic magic. The idea was that like cured, like so. If an animal had been cured by its own waste, then somehow using that waste on humans would bring healing. One of the most popular uses of dung was as a topical treatment. Horse manure was particularly prized for its ability to draw out infection and cure wounds. People believed it could cleanse the body of bad humors, a medieval medical theory that stated diseases were caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. To make things even worse, the dung was often left to rot for a period before being used, which only increased the risk of infection. Some would apply the manure directly to their skin as a form of poultice, while others would mix it into medicinal concoctions. Unsurprisingly, these practices often led to worsening infections, gangrene, and eventually death. But the practice wasn't confined to external use. There are reports of people actually ingesting animal dung, believing it would cure internal ailments. Chicken droppings were consumed in hopes of curing digestive problems, while cow manure was thought to help with various bodily pains. The idea was that these waste products contained vital energy, which could be transferred to the person using them. However, they were, of course, riddled with bacteria, parasites, and other pathogens that made the situation much worse. Even more bizarre was the use of pigeon dung. Some believed that pigeon droppings could treat eye infections, so people would rub them into their eyes or use the droppings in eye washes. Imagine the scene. People eagerly placing their faith in a remedy that, in reality, would have caused serious harm. eye infections would often become more severe, leading to blindness, while other internal ailments worsened from consuming infected waste. It's hard to believe now, but for medieval people, this practice was a normal part of their health routines, backed by a very strange mix of superstition, trial and error, and a lack of understanding about germs and hygiene. So, the next time you find yourself feeling ill, take a moment to appreciate modern medicine and the fact that we no longer rely on poop as a cure-all. As we continue our strange journey through medieval trends, let's turn our attention to a subject that's both fascinating and deadly: makeup. You might not immediately associate beauty trends with death, but in the medieval era, looking your best could be a dangerous game. The elites of society, particularly women, often turned to cosmetics to enhance their appearance, only to end up with more than they bargained for. Some of the makeup choices were not just harmful, they were lethal. Picture this. You're in a medieval court surrounded by beautiful women with pale faces, rosy cheeks, and perfectly red lips. Their beauty rituals might look like something out of an old painting, but behind that flawless facade, there's a deadly secret. The pale skin that was so coveted was often achieved by using a lead-based white powder, which was made from lead carbonate. This concoction was widely used in the belief that it gave the skin a youthful and refined appearance. But the side effects were nothing short of disastrous. Over time, lead poisoning would set in, leading to symptoms like memory loss, headaches, abdominal pain, and ultimately, kidney failure. The very makeup that was supposed to enhance their beauty ended up slowly killing them. But lead wasn't the only dangerous ingredient in these medieval beauty products. Mercury, another toxic substance, was used to treat skin imperfections and give a glowing complexion. It was commonly found in cosmetics like face creams and hair dyes. Unfortunately, this substance is highly toxic, and prolonged exposure could lead to mercury poisoning, with symptoms such as tremors, numbness, irritability, and even death. What was supposed to make someone beautiful was, in fact, a slow-acting poison. As if that weren't enough, medieval beauty also included rouge to give a blush to the cheeks. The makeup was typically made from vermilion, a bright red pigment that contained mercury sulfide, another deadly substance. The problem with vermilion wasn't just the danger of mercury. It was also highly toxic if absorbed into the skin, leading to various health issues, from nerve damage to organ failure. The pursuit of beauty during the medieval era often came at a heavy price, and many of the women who followed these trends paid with their health and, tragically, their lives. In the end, the medieval beauty industry was just as dangerous as it was glamorous. The pursuit of pale skin, rosy cheeks, and a glowing complexion was fraught with peril, as the products that were supposed to elevate one's beauty were often laced with deadly toxins. So, while modern beauty products have their own risks, it's safe to say that medieval cosmetics took beauty standards to a whole new, deadly level. Now let's take a step into the world of medieval alchemy, a world where people would risk everything in the pursuit of something almost unimaginable: immortality. Imagine yourself standing in the midst of a medieval alchemist's workshop, surrounded by strange bottles, bubbling liquids, and ancient scrolls. The alchemists believed they could transmute base metals into gold, and even more audaciously, they believed they could unlock the secret to eternal life. This quest for immortality wasn't just a dream for the wealthy and powerful. It was an obsession, and it led many to a tragic end. You walk through the door and are immediately hit with the smell of burnt herbs and strange concoctions. In one corner, a group of alchemists is feverishly working over a flame, carefully preparing a potion of life. The idea was simple. By combining specific ingredients, they believed they could create an elixir that would not only prevent aging, but grant immortality. Unfortunately, the ingredients they chose were far from magical. They were poisonous. Scholars still argue whether these alchemists were truly convinced they could achieve immortality, or whether it was all part of the mystique surrounding the profession. What's clear, however, is that many of these concoctions were made with substances like mercury, arsenic, and lead, all of which were deadly. And as these alchemists experimented with these substances in their quest for eternal life, many met their own untimely deaths. Some alchemists believed that by ingesting gold, they could unlock its mystical properties and prolong their lives. But in reality, gold doesn't have any of the magical qualities they hoped for. Instead, they often ended up poisoning themselves with other metals in the process. The desire for immortality was so consuming that they would mix toxic minerals into their elixirs and take the risk of ingesting them, sometimes with fatal consequences. Then there were the philosopher's stones, legendary substances said to be capable of granting immortality. Many believed these stones could turn any metal into gold, but more importantly, they were seen as the key to eternal life. But the stones never materialized. Instead, some alchemists spent their entire lives searching for them, using dangerous chemicals and alchemical processes that eventually led to their deaths. They were consumed by the idea of unlocking the secrets of life. But it was their own reckless pursuit of immortality that cut their lives short. So, as we reflect on this period, we can't help but wonder, how many lives were lost in pursuit of a dream that was ultimately unattainable? The quest for immortality is as old as time itself, and it remains one of the most tragic aspects of medieval history. Those who searched for it may have believed they were on the brink of something extraordinary, but in the end, they became another casualty in a long line of those who sought the impossible. Imagine yourself in a medieval kitchen where the air is thick with the scent of boiling stews and freshly baked bread. The tables are laden with foods that are meant to nourish the body. Yet many of these foods were just as likely to kill you as to sustain you. While we often think of medieval diets as simple, the reality was far more dangerous than we might imagine. People during this time often ate what was available to them, but unfortunately, the foods they consumed often carried serious health risks. You sit down for a meal, and the first thing you notice is the heavy presence of meat. In medieval times, meat was a luxury for those who could afford it. But here's the catch. Meat was often preserved by methods that were less than ideal. It was salted, dried, or even smoked. But many of these preservation techniques led to the growth of dangerous bacteria. Consuming undercooked or improperly preserved meat was a common cause of foodborne illnesses, which could quickly turn deadly. In fact, medieval people didn't have the understanding of bacteria and hygiene that we have today, so food poisoning was a far more common and often fatal occurrence. But meat wasn't the only dangerous item in the medieval diet. You might also find yourself dining on a bread-based meal, as bread was a staple food. However, this wasn't just any bread. The grain used to make the bread often contained ergot, a type of fungus that grew on rye. Ergot was highly toxic and caused ergotism, which could lead to symptoms such as hallucinations, convulsions, and, in severe cases, gangrene or death. The consumption of ergot-tainted bread could cause mass outbreaks of this deadly condition, making it one of the most common and fatal food-related dangers of the time. Dairy products weren't much better. In a time before refrigeration, milk was often stored in unsanitary conditions, and cheese wasn't always properly aged. The lack of proper storage and preservation techniques meant that dairy products could quickly go bad, leading to foodborne infections. In the worst cases, people consumed spoiled dairy that led to salmonella or other bacterial infections, which could cause severe illness or death. Perhaps one of the most dangerous elements of the medieval diet was the use of spices. While they were highly prized, many spices used in medieval cooking, like nutmeg and cloves, were incredibly expensive and often adulterated with toxic substances. Some merchants would mix in lead or other harmful chemicals to increase the weight and value of the spices, unknowingly poisoning those who used them in their meals. And if you were lucky enough to be wealthy, you may have enjoyed some sugar, a luxury reserved for the elite. But the sugar was often unrefined and contained impurities that could lead to dangerous conditions like tooth decay and gum disease, not to mention the increase in health problems caused by consuming sugar in large quantities. Despite its luxurious appeal, sugar became just another deadly indulgence. So, while the medieval diet may have seemed filling and hearty, it was often a deadly game of chance. The food was prepared with little knowledge of nutrition or hygiene, and the consequences were often fatal. The next time you sit down for a meal, take a moment to appreciate modern food safety standards that keep us safe from these medieval dangers. Now let's shift gears and take a look at one of the more macabre medieval pastimes: public executions. In today's world, the idea of attending a public execution seems almost incomprehensible. But in medieval times, it was considered not only a form of punishment, but also a public spectacle, an event that drew large crowds. It was a form of entertainment for many, though the cost was tragically high for those who found themselves at the mercy of the executioner's blade. Picture yourself walking through a medieval town square, the sound of the crowd's chatter rising as you approach the gallows or the block. The atmosphere is charged with anticipation. People have gathered from far and wide, drawn by the promise of a show. But unlike the entertainment we enjoy today, these events were filled with real bloodshed and real death. You may have come for the drama, but what you were really watching was a human being's life being ended, often in a brutal and public manner. Scholars still argue whether these public executions were more about deterrence or entertainment, but one thing is clear: they were a significant part of medieval culture. Executions weren't just a punishment. They were often carefully orchestrated events designed to instill fear and to keep the masses in line. The most common forms of execution, hanging, beheading, and burning at the stake, were not just quick killings. They were drawn out, gruesome, and often took place in front of hundreds, if not thousands, of spectators. It was the burning at the stake that became a particularly infamous spectacle. People were often burned for heresy or witchcraft, and the flames that consumed them were not only a form of capital punishment, but a public form of humiliation. The crowds would gather, some cheering, some jeering, and others looking on in horror as the person met their fiery end. The gruesome nature of the death was meant to serve as a warning to others, to show what could happen to anyone who dared challenge the status quo. In addition to burnings, the infamous hanging was also a common spectacle. But this wasn't the quick, clean form of execution we might imagine. Hanging in the medieval era often involved a long drop and sometimes resulted in slow strangulation instead of instant death, prolonging the suffering for hours in front of an audience. And let's not forget the brutality of beheading. Though it may sound swift and decisive, the executioner's job was often far more difficult than it appeared, and many executions were botched, leading to prolonged agony for the condemned. For the masses, these executions were entertainment, and for the authorities, they were a form of control. It was a gruesome practice, but it was so ingrained in medieval life that it became a part of public culture. The sense of justice, of punishment for wrongdoers, was met with a perverse form of celebration. But what's most disturbing about these executions is that they were viewed as a spectacle for the public. The human cost of these shows was lost on many who attended, only there to see the drama unfold. So, next time you read about the medieval period, try to imagine yourself in that crowd, feeling the heat from the fire or hearing the rope creak under the weight of the condemned. Public executions weren't just about justice, they were about keeping control over a population through fear, and they were deadly to those who found themselves caught in this brutal form of public entertainment. Now, we arrive at one of the darkest chapters of medieval history, the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. This devastating pandemic wiped out nearly a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, and its impact was felt across all levels of society. But while the plague spread death and despair, it also sparked a wave of superstition and misguided remedies that did little to stop the spread of the disease, and often made things worse. Imagine walking through a medieval town during the peak of the plague. The streets are eerily quiet, with the sick lying in homes, many too weak to even cry out for help. The air is thick with the scent of death, and people are desperate for any kind of solution to stop the relentless spread of the disease. But instead of seeking scientific solutions, many turned to superstitions and religious rituals in the hope of warding off death. Scholars still argue about how much of the plague's spread was influenced by these superstitions, but one thing is certain: people believed the plague was either a punishment from God or the result of evil spirits. As a result, they turned to all kinds of bizarre practices to protect themselves. For instance, some believed that the plague could be fought off by carrying charms or amulets, which were thought to ward off the evil influences causing the disease. These amulets were often filled with magical symbols or inscribed with religious prayers, but sadly, they were as ineffective as they were dangerous. One of the more extreme practices involved flagellants, Groups of people who would publicly whip themselves to atone for the supposed sins of society, hoping that their self-inflicted pain would make God lift the plague. These flagellants would march through towns, openly flogging themselves in front of crowds, believing that this was a form of purification. While they may have hoped to avert death, they were often spreading the plague instead, as many of them became infected through open wounds and the unsanitary conditions of their movements. On the other end of the spectrum, some turned to magic potions and herbal remedies, often concocted by self-proclaimed healers who had no understanding of the disease. These so-called cures ranged from the absurd to the downright dangerous. For example, one popular treatment involved drinking wine spiked with crushed emeralds. While the emeralds did nothing to prevent the plague, the wine itself was often tainted with bacteria, leading to food poisoning and other illnesses. And let's not forget the plague doctors. Those who wore strange masks designed to protect them from the bad air or miasma that was believed to carry the plague. These masks, with long beaks stuffed with herbs, were intended to shield the doctors from the disease. In reality, the masks offered no protection against the bacteria that caused the plague, and the doctors who wore them were just as likely to fall ill as anyone else. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like to live through such a time where superstition was the only answer to a disease that was invisible and mysterious. The medieval world was filled with desperate, misguided attempts to fend off the plague, and while some of these practices were born from good intentions, they only made the situation worse. The true lesson of the Black Death lies not in the superstitions people clung to, but in the importance of scientific understanding and hygiene in the face of epidemics. So, as we reflect on the tragedy of the plague, let's be grateful that we now have the tools to fight diseases with facts and medicine, rather than relying on magical thinking and potions. Let's take a step back from medicine and delve into the world of medieval fashion, where what you wore could very well mean the difference between life and death. The medieval era had its fair share of dangerous fashion trends, but one of the most perplexing was the obsession with long beards, especially for men. These facial hair trends were not just about style or masculinity. In some cases, they became lethal symbols of vanity. Imagine yourself in a medieval town where men proudly display their long, bushy beards, believing that they're the ultimate symbol of strength and status. At first glance, they seem harmless, but as you look closer, you realize that these long beards were actually a health hazard. Long beards, which had become a popular trend among knights and nobles, often collected dirt, food, and bacteria from daily life. Scholars still argue whether medieval beards were a statement of nobility, wisdom, or simply a fashion statement, but the truth is that many men who wore them didn't think about the health risks involved. The long beards could become a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and other parasites, leading to infections that could turn deadly, but the hazards didn't end with hygiene issues. Long beards could also become a tactical disadvantage during battles. Knights with flowing beards were at risk of having them grabbed by opponents during hand-to-hand combat, which could quickly turn into a fatal situation. In one infamous battle, a knight's long beard was seized by his opponent, causing the knight to lose his footing and ultimately his life. In a time where combat was unpredictable and often savage, anything that could give an opponent an advantage, like grabbing hold of a beard, was a dangerous liability. Then there was the issue of the beard's weight itself. As men grew their beards longer, they often faced the physical strain of neck and jaw discomfort. Over time, this could lead to neck problems, chronic pain, and, in severe cases, nerve damage from the constant pressure of the beard on the skin and muscles. And while some nobles would keep their beards clean, many others allowed them to grow unchecked, leading to constant skin infections and even abscesses. As the medieval world progressed, the long beard became less of a symbol of honor and more of a symbol of recklessness. The very thing that was meant to show strength and status was, in reality, a dangerous fashion choice that could lead to infections, battlefield vulnerability, and painful health issues. So, next time you see someone proudly sporting a long beard, remember that in medieval times, the trend could have led to a lot more than just a fashion disaster. It could have been a matter of life and death. Tonight, let's step into the world of medieval beauty treatments, a world where the pursuit of beauty and health often led to tragic outcomes. Much like today, medieval men and women were obsessed with looking their best, but the methods they used to enhance their appearance were not only ineffective, they were dangerous. If you thought today's beauty fads were wild, you haven't heard about the bizarre and sometimes lethal treatments people underwent in the medieval era. You find yourself in the lavish court of a medieval noble, surrounded by women with perfectly plucked eyebrows, pale faces, and rosy cheeks. But the beauty of these women was achieved through some truly deadly practices. The desire for pale skin, which was considered a mark of beauty and social status, was so great that many women turned to lead-based cosmetics. The most popular of these was a whitening powder made from lead carbonate, which was applied to the face to give it that ideal porcelain-like appearance. But while it made their faces look beautiful, the lead quickly entered their bloodstream, causing lead poisoning. Symptoms of lead poisoning included nausea, headaches, abdominal pain, and, in many cases, death. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the cosmetics themselves that were toxic. It was the way they were applied. In the absence of modern understanding of toxins, women were often applying these deadly substances daily, unaware of the damage they were doing to their health. But beauty in the medieval world didn't stop with face makeup. Many women also used toxic hair treatments to keep their hair shiny and thick. A popular treatment involved rubbing urine into the scalp, which was believed to help hair grow stronger. While urine is not inherently dangerous in the unsanitary medieval world, it was often contaminated with bacteria and could cause infections when applied to the skin. Some also believed that animal fats and animal bile could work wonders for hair care. These substances were not only unpleasant, but could cause irritation, folliculitis, and even scalp infections. And then there was the medieval obsession with permanent makeup, particularly the practice of tattooing. While tattoos are certainly common today, they were a symbol of beauty, rebellion, and spirituality in the medieval world. But the inks used were often not regulated, and many contained poisonous metals like mercury and arsenic. These substances could lead to severe skin reactions, allergic reactions, and, in extreme cases, death from systemic poisoning. One of the most bizarre beauty treatments was bleeding, a practice that was used not only to cure diseases, but also as a way to maintain beauty and health. The idea was that draining blood from the body would purify it. Unfortunately, this practice often left people weak and malnourished, and many died from blood loss or infection. Women, in particular, were often subjected to bleeding as a way to correct their appearance, leading to long-term health problems. While these beauty treatments were intended to improve appearance, they often had the opposite effect, leading to infections, poisoning, and early death. Medieval beauty rituals were often based on superstition and a lack of understanding of health and hygiene, and their pursuit came at a steep price. So, the next time you find yourself frustrated with modern beauty standards or cosmetic fads, just be thankful that we've moved past the era of lead-laced powder and urine hair treatments. Beauty may be skin deep, but in medieval times it often went much deeper, into death. We take a look at a rather dark side of medieval recreation, sports that weren't just about competition, but about brutality and death. While many people today view sports as a form of healthy competition, medieval sports often came with the high risk of injury or even death. If you thought modern sports were dangerous, the medieval versions were in a league of their own, where the stakes were life and death. Imagine stepping into a medieval arena where men and women eagerly gather to watch the latest contest, whether it's a jousting tournament, a sword fight, or a game of ball. These sports were often violent and left spectators on the edge of their seats, not because of the athleticism, but because of the danger involved. For knights, jousting was the pinnacle of competitive sport. It was a test of skill, strength, and bravery, where two knights would charge at each other with lances aimed directly at their opponent. The goal was to knock the other off their horse, but the reality was that this sport was incredibly dangerous. Knights were often impaled, fractured bones, or knocked unconscious in the process. And while many survived, there were countless instances where a joust ended in death due to the sheer force of the impact. Then there were the sword fights, not your casual sparring matches, but full-fledged competitions where the objective was to maim or kill the opponent. These duels were often fought to settle disputes over honor or property. The knights and soldiers who participated didn't have modern protective gear, so they were exposed to fatal injuries from sword strikes, blunt force trauma, and broken bones. In fact, many of these duels were arranged as legal combat in which the outcome determined the fate of the parties involved. The idea was that God would decide the right person to win, but in reality, it was just a brutal fight that led to death or severe injury. But it wasn't just knights and soldiers who participated in deadly sports. Archery competitions were also common. These contests involved shooting arrows at a target, but the tension and danger were elevated by the crowds and the sometimes deadly stakes. Archery was a skill that could determine a soldier's worth in battle, but in competitive tournaments things could quickly go wrong. Archers, often using longbows, had a high potential for accidental injury. The wooden shafts were heavy, and a misfired arrow could easily end in death. Even with the strict rules and the need for accuracy, accidents still occurred, leading to fatalities in the name of sport. And let's not forget the bear baiting and bull baiting that were often seen as sports in medieval towns. These cruel events involved releasing animals like bears, bulls, and even dogs, and watching them fight each other for sport. Spectators would cheer as animals were injured, sometimes fatally, for their entertainment. The animals were often tortured before the fight, and while this wasn't a human sport, it was a gruesome and deadly event for the creatures involved, and it left people with a callous attitude toward life. In addition to these bloody games, medieval times also had less violent but still dangerous sports, such as foot races, wrestling matches, and heavy stone throwing. While not as fatal as jousting, these sports were still risky and often led to broken limbs, concussions, or worse. The sports of medieval times were brutal, and survival often depended not on skill or strategy, but on sheer luck and strength. Today, when we look at our modern sports, we might think they're intense, but they're nothing compared to the life or death struggles that medieval athletes endured. So next time you watch a sporting event, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come from the brutal games of the past. Tonight, we take a step into one of the most famous and deadly quests in history: the search for the Holy Grail. You've probably heard the tales of brave knights and daring adventurers searching for this legendary relic believed to possess unimaginable power. But what if I told you that this quest wasn't just a matter of seeking a powerful artifact? It was a foolish pursuit that cost many lives, led people to endure unimaginable hardships, and ultimately resulted in failure for most who sought it. Picture yourself in the midst of a medieval court, surrounded by knights, monks, and noblemen, all gathered to discuss the Holy Grail, an object that was believed to have mystical and healing powers. The idea of obtaining this artifact was intoxicating. Many believed that whoever found the Grail would gain divine favor, immortality, or even the ability to heal the sick. But the truth behind the Grail was more myth than reality. Scholars still argue whether the Grail was ever anything more than a symbolic object in Christian tradition, but its allure was undeniable. The Crusaders, in their unyielding pursuit of the Grail, risked everything: their fortunes, their lives, and their souls. One of the most famous episodes in the Grail's history was the First Crusade, launched in 1096 by Pope Urban II. While the official goal was to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims, the Grail was often used as a rallying symbol, inspiring knights to fight and die in its name. But the truth was that the Grail wasn't sitting in Jerusalem, waiting for the right knight to claim it. It was fictitious, and those who believed they could find it were ultimately destined for failure. Despite this, countless lives were lost in the pursuit. The Crusaders faced unimaginable hardships, from brutal combat to starvation, and many died from diseases like dysentery. But the most tragic aspect of this campaign wasn't just the physical toll it took on the knights, it was the psychological toll of chasing after a myth. These men, fueled by faith, were convinced they were on a divine mission. But in the end, their quest for the Holy Grail resulted in the deaths of thousands, with no Grail in sight. Even after the Crusades, the Grail continued to be a symbol of human folly. Many believed it was hidden in various places. Some said it was kept in Glastonbury Abbey in England. Others claimed it was hidden in the catacombs of Paris. Entire expeditions were launched to find the Grail, each more desperate than the last, but none ever succeeded in finding it. These expeditions led to further loss of life as explorers were lured to dangerous, unknown territories in search of an impossible dream. The Grail's allure was more than just an object of desire. It became a symbol of blind faith,
where men were willing to sacrifice everything for something they couldn't prove existed. In the end, the Grail may have been more about the idea of salvation than the actual object itself. But the toll it took on those who pursued it was real. The search for the Holy Grail serves as a reminder of how human desire can drive people to extremes, often leading to death, destruction, and disappointment. So next time you hear a story about knights in shining armor gallantly seeking the Holy Grail, remember that many of them didn't return, and those who did were forever changed, chasing a myth that never truly existed. Their quest wasn't just about the Grail, it was about the dangers of chasing something unattainable and the cost of doing so. Tonight, we delve into a fascinating and deadly aspect of medieval society: beauty standards. While we may think of today's beauty trends as outlandish or extreme, the medieval elite took their obsession with beauty to a whole new level, often risking their lives to meet the societal expectations of the time. The desire to achieve the ideal look was so powerful that it led many to dangerous extremes, from poisonous cosmetics to extreme weight loss tactics that were as lethal as they were fashionable. Imagine stepping into the extravagant courts of medieval Europe, where noble women are obsessively trying to achieve the perfect complexion, the smallest waist, and the most delicate features. The beauty standards were strict, and failure to adhere to them could mean social ostracism or a loss of status. But here's the shocking truth. Many of these beauty practices were deadly. One of the most prevalent beauty ideals during the medieval period was the pursuit of an extremely pale complexion. Pale skin was considered a sign of wealth and nobility, as it suggested that a woman didn't have to work outside in the fields like peasants. To achieve this look, women turned to deadly substances like lead-based cosmetics to whiten their skin. The most common of these was Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that was applied to the face to give it an unnaturally smooth and pale appearance. Unfortunately, the lead would slowly poison the skin, leading to severe rashes, skin decay, and, in many cases, death. While this practice was used for centuries, it often went unnoticed until the damage had already been done, and many women died prematurely as a result. Beyond pale skin, there was also a desire for an impossibly tiny waist, which led to another dangerous practice: the tight lacing of corsets. Corsets were a staple of fashion, and they were designed to constrict the waist and create an hourglass figure. But these garments were so tight that they often caused internal damage. Women who wore them regularly suffered from difficulty breathing, fainting, and organ displacement. In some extreme cases, the tight corset could cause broken ribs, suffocation, and even death. But despite these risks, the trend continued for centuries, as women were willing to endure immense pain for the sake of fashion. In addition to these external beauty treatments, medieval women also followed dangerous beauty rituals that involved the use of poisonous herbs and dangerous diets to maintain a delicate figure. Many resorted to extreme measures to lose weight, such as starvation or consuming toxic substances like purgatives. These purgatives, which were believed to cleanse the body, often contained toxic substances like mercury or arsenic, both of which could lead to poisoning and death. And then there were the extreme measures taken to improve one's teeth.
The medieval pursuit of a perfect smile led people to use methods such as charcoal or even ground bones to whiten teeth. While these might seem like harmless beauty tricks, they caused serious damage to dental health and often led to gum disease, tooth loss, and even blood poisoning. What's truly chilling about these beauty standards is that they weren't just limited to the wealthy. The obsession with looking a certain way was so ingrained in society that even the poorer classes tried to emulate these practices, often with deadly consequences. The ideal of youthful beauty, with its emphasis on pale skin, tiny waists, and flawless features, was seen as a way to gain social status and approval. However, this pursuit often came at the cost of health, and sometimes even life. So the next time you hear someone complain about modern beauty standards, remember that medieval beauty ideals were not only extreme, they were life-threatening. The desire to conform to an ideal of beauty, no matter the cost, led to countless deaths throughout history. It's a sobering reminder of how far people will go to meet society's expectations, even when those expectations are built on dangerous and deadly practices. Tonight, we dive into one of the most dangerous aspects of medieval fashion, the deadly allure of trendy clothes. While today's fashion risks might involve high heels or tight jeans, in medieval times, some of the most popular styles could literally set you on fire. And we're not talking metaphorically. The medieval period had a strange obsession with clothing made from highly flammable materials, and some of the most fashionable trends of the time became the perfect recipe for disaster. Imagine yourself in the bustling streets of a medieval city, surrounded by noblemen and women proudly strutting around in their sumptuous gowns and elaborate tunics, all made of beautiful but flammable fabrics like silk and velvet. At first glance, they look stunning, glistening with jewels, flowing in the wind, and trimmed with gold. But here's the catch. These fabrics were far from safe, especially when paired with the lighting of the time. Candles, torches, and even open hearths were often nearby, and the slightest spark could ignite the whole outfit. Scholars still argue about the exact reasons why medieval fashion was so focused on fabrics that could catch fire, but one thing is certain: beauty often took precedence over safety. The rich and the noble were particularly prone to indulging in risky styles. The high collars, voluminous sleeves, and elaborate layers of their gowns were made of silk and taffeta, materials that, while luxurious, were incredibly flammable. In fact, silk, when exposed to an open flame, can catch fire almost instantly. But instead of focusing on practicality, fashion dictated that these garments were essential for status and appearance, and the risk of fire was simply an unfortunate consequence that came with the territory. One of the most famous and tragic examples of this occurred during grand feasts or balls, where the combination of large open flames and long flowing garments created a perfect storm for disaster. Women's dresses, which were often made from silk and trimmed with gold or silver thread, were prone to sudden bursts of fire. In some cases, noble women and high-born ladies were killed because their clothes caught fire while they were near an open hearth or candlelight. A momentary spark,
could cause their silk gowns to go up in flames, and due to the amount of fabric and the difficulty of extinguishing the fire, many did not survive the burns. But this fashion risk wasn't just a concern for women. Men, too, were victims of their own fashion choices. Wealthy men often wore wide sleeves and layered tunics, which could easily catch fire when near a flame. A nobleman's garb, often lavish and designed to showcase his wealth, could be his undoing when it came in contact with even the smallest flame. The flame-retardant clothing we take for granted today was a far-off dream, and the medieval world didn't yet understand the importance of safety in fashion. And let's not forget about the accessories. Plumes, feathers, and headdresses made from exotic materials were all the rage among the nobility, but many of these embellishments were also highly flammable. As people walked past torches or stood near fireplaces, the slightest gust of wind could send sparks flying into their headgear or decorative feathers, igniting them instantly. The risk of fire wasn't something that people thought about in medieval times. Rather, they viewed their clothing as a symbol of wealth, status, and piety. Tragically, the higher the status, the more dangerous the clothing often was. The desire for luxury and beauty ultimately led to the deaths of many of those who were most susceptible to fashion's deadly allure. So, the next time you think about a dangerous fashion trend, consider this. Medieval trends literally went up in flames. The next time you're at a fancy dinner or ball, be thankful that the materials used for today's clothing are far less likely to send you to an early grave. The medieval pursuit of beauty was often a life-threatening gamble. As we venture deeper into the strange and sometimes deadly world of medieval society, let's take a look at a peculiar and rather absurd phenomenon: wars over fashionable colors. While today's arguments over fashion trends might involve debates about what's in or out, medieval people took their color choices much more seriously, sometimes to the point of starting conflicts and wars. Color wasn't just about looking good, it was about power, politics, and even life or death. Imagine yourself at a grand medieval court, where noblemen and noblewomen are adorned in richly colored robes and gowns. Each hue is carefully chosen, not just for its beauty, but for its symbolic significance. Colors like purple and scarlet weren't just fashionable, they were luxuries that signified wealth and status. But as with most things related to power, color quickly became a point of contention. What you wore and the color of it could start an entire conflict. The most famous and absurd example of this fashion-based feud was the English Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars fought between two factions: the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, and the House of York, whose symbol was a white rose. While the main cause of this conflict was the struggle for the throne, the intense symbolism of these roses, one red, one white, became a driving force behind the bloody conflict. The two sides often rallied around these color-coded symbols, and the very notion of wearing a specific color became an act of allegiance. Soldiers wore the colors of their houses as identifiers, but what seemed like a harmless fashion choice turned into a full-blown war. These fashion-based battles weren't just about choosing the right color to wear. They were about showing loyalty to the ruling house. The color you wore could signify your political allegiance, and in some cases, could even lead to violence or death.
Entire armies would rally to fight for control over the symbolic power of a color, and the wars that followed led to countless lives lost over what was essentially a dispute over fashion. And the impact of color wasn't limited to politics. The desire for rare and expensive colors also had deadly consequences. The creation of these rich, vibrant dyes often involved toxic substances. One of the most coveted colors was purple, which was produced by grinding tiny sea creatures, murex snails. The process of obtaining the dye was not only labor-intensive, but also dangerous, as the chemicals involved could cause poisoning. The same went for red dyes, which were often derived from the cochineal insect, another process that was both hazardous and unsanitary. But perhaps the most absurd example of fashion and color causing harm was the overuse of toxic dyes in clothing. The demand for rich, vibrant colors led to the use of arsenic-based dyes in some fabrics. These dyes were highly toxic and could poison anyone who wore them regularly, leading to symptoms like nausea, vomiting, and death. The pursuit of fashion and beauty was often an unintentional game of Russian roulette, one where you could literally be poisoned by your choice of clothing. So, as we look back at these strange medieval fashion wars, we can only shake our heads at how the color of someone's gown or tunic became a symbol of political power, status, and, in some cases, death. It's a reminder of how something as trivial as a color could become so entwined with identity and loyalty that it sparked conflict, and in the end, how it often led to tragic consequences for those involved. As we delve deeper into the eerie practices of medieval society, let's turn our attention to the rituals that defined many of their beliefs and customs. While today, we might think of sacrifices and rituals as remnants of the past. In medieval times, they were very much alive and often tied to superstitions and religious fervor. What's more disturbing is that these rituals were sometimes fatal, with lives lost in the pursuit of spiritual purity, divine favor, or societal control. Imagine yourself in the heart of a medieval village where people gather around a sacred altar, chanting in a language you don't understand. The air is heavy with incense, and the flicker of torchlight casts long shadows over the crowd. The ceremony you're witnessing is more than a mere religious observance. It's a sacrifice, and incredibly, many believed that these sacrifices, sometimes human, were necessary to appease the gods and secure favor for their community. One of the most famous and chilling medieval practices involved sacrificial rites, where animals, and in some extreme cases, humans, were offered up to appease deities or spirits. These rituals often took place at the height of plague outbreaks or after natural disasters, as people sought answers to why misfortune had befallen them. The belief was that sacrifice could restore balance, end plagues, or endear the community to the divine. Scholars still debate the prevalence of human sacrifice in medieval Europe, but it was documented in some regions. In particular, Viking cultures are infamous for their blots, or sacrificial feasts, where animals, usually horses, were slaughtered and offered to the gods. The ritual was intended to ensure victory in battle, good harvests, or prosperity. However, there were extreme instances where humans, often prisoners of war or slaves, were sacrificed as a way to appease deities and ensure that the warriors would be granted victory in their wars. One of the most bizarre and disturbing aspects of these rituals was the practice of ritual killing.
often done to ensure the success of an important mission or to maintain the favor of powerful gods. While human sacrifice wasn't as widespread as the stories suggest, there are instances where it was used as a desperate measure during periods of extreme distress. During times of war, famine, or plague, people believed that sacrificing a human life could bring divine intervention to their suffering communities. But the dangers didn't end there. Medieval witches, believed to have the power to communicate with spirits, were sometimes sacrificed in rituals meant to banish evil or bring about positive change. Witch trials, notorious for their brutality, often led to innocent people being burned at the stake or drowned in public ceremonies. The practice was rooted in fear, ignorance, and the belief that certain individuals could harness supernatural power for harmful purposes. The result was death, not only for the accused witches, but for anyone caught in the web of medieval superstition. Perhaps one of the most gruesome examples of a ritual sacrifice occurred during the Black Death. When the plague struck, people became desperate, and many believed the solution was to appease God through extreme religious practices. There were reports of self-flagellation, where individuals would whip themselves in the streets in hopes of purging their own sins to stop the plague. Some even believed that sacrificial offerings of virgins would drive away the plague and bring divine favor. These misguided rituals often ended in bloodshed, as desperate villagers sacrificed everything in hopes of securing safety for their loved ones. It's easy to look back and view these practices as primitive or barbaric, but to those living in the medieval era, they were deeply rooted in the cultural and spiritual fabric of their lives. People believed that these rituals were the only way to secure favor from the divine and to cure society's ills. But the cost was steep, and many lives, both innocent and guilty, were sacrificed in the name of faith, power, and survival. As we reflect on these rituals, we are reminded of how much humanity has evolved in terms of understanding the world and the consequences of our actions. Today, we can look back at these practices with a sense of gratitude that they are no longer the accepted norms, and that we no longer need to risk lives in the name of superstition and misguided beliefs. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through medieval history, let's turn our focus to the treacherous world of court intrigue, a place where betrayal, backstabbing, and deadly power struggles were all part of the game. In medieval courts, especially among the nobility and royalty, the pursuit of power and influence often led to deception, poisonings, and sometimes murder. The allure of high status and wealth was so strong that people were willing to risk everything, including their lives, to gain a position of favor. Imagine yourself in a grand medieval palace surrounded by royal courtiers and noblemen dressed in their finest garments, each vying for the king or queen's favor. The halls are filled with whispered conversations, calculated glances, and promises of loyalty, but behind the surface of pomp and circumstance lies a web of deceit and betrayal. Those who sought power didn't hesitate to use any means necessary to achieve their goals, even if it meant killing their rivals. One of the most notorious methods of courtly sabotage was the use of poison. In an age where food and drink were easily manipulated, poisoning became a popular and effective way to eliminate rivals without drawing attention. Royal families, in particular, were often poisoned by those closest to them, servants, family members, or even trusted advisors. Poisoning was a silent killer. In many cases, a victim would succumb to the effects without anyone suspecting foul play until it was too late. It was a calculated and efficient way to get rid of an enemy while maintaining plausible deniability. In some medieval courts, poisoned cups and spiked food were common tools in the art of political assassination. One famous example is the story of Pope Alexander VI, whose papacy was marred by scandals, including the suspected poisoning of his political enemies. The use of poison in his court was so rampant that it became a defining characteristic of the era. Courtiers would use it to take down anyone who stood in their way, whether they were rivals for the throne or simply people who had fallen out of favor. But poisoning wasn't the only weapon used in the deadly game of court politics. Assassinations were often carried out with swords, daggers, or even crossbows by hired mercenaries or disguised assassins. These murderers, who often worked in the shadows, would be paid handsomely to eliminate a target, whether that target was an enemy noble, an opposing faction's leader, or even a disloyal member of the royal family. The killing was often swift and brutal, and those who were caught trying to carry out such acts were executed without mercy. The danger of betrayal was always looming over the courtiers and royalty. One misstep, one poorly chosen word could lead to an early death at the hands of someone once trusted. Plots and conspiracies were a daily part of life at court. Kings and queens were often forced to rely on their closest allies to keep them safe, but these very allies were just as likely to turn on them if it meant gaining power. A famous example is Richard III of England, whose rise to power was marked by the suspicious deaths of family members and rivals alike, leading to the tragic mystery of his brother's disappearance and eventual murder. But the dangers of court intrigue didn't just affect the nobles. It could trickle down to commoners as well, people who were accused of conspiring against the throne or betraying the royal family often faced public execution or torture. Even the slightest hint of disloyalty could mean death.